Welcome to Life Stories, where we dive deep into tales of courage, justice, and transformation. Today's story follows Judge Anthony Carter, a man known for his unwavering dedication to truth in a world corrupted by money and power. As one of the city's wealthiest and most influential men, Alexander Caldwell faces the consequences of his actions. The case takes unexpected twists that reveal the dark underbelly of a system built on greed. Join us as we explore how one man's stand for justice sparked a citywide revolution. Make sure to subscribe and follow along as we begin today's powerful story. It's said that in this city, money doesn't just open doors, it owns them. For decades, Alexander Caldwell's wealth had placed him in a realm where innocence was a mere afterthought, and guilt was nothing more than a number on a check. The city's power structures, its most influential institutions, had all bent to his will. He had a signature that graced the bottom of every dirty deal, a reputation so large that just mentioning his name was enough to send shivers through the most hardened men. And in his eyes, no one, no matter their position, was beyond his reach. But in a world where Caldwell's money could drown any inconvenient truth, there stood one man who knew that some truths couldn't be buried, no matter how much money you had. His name was Judge Michael Carter, and they called him the last honest man in a system where honesty had long been sold to the highest bidder. I grew up in Brooklyn, one of the toughest parts of the city, and every memory of my childhood taught me something about strength. My mother worked 3 jobs just to make sure I could have a future that led me to the bench where I stood firm. Over the years, I earned a reputation for refusing to look away from corruption. No matter how many powerful people tried to buy me out, the idea of justice, true justice, had always been my guiding light. And now, as I prepared for the most important case of my career, I knew that this trial would test everything I believed in. Alexander Caldwell was a man who believed his wealth could silence any voice that stood in his way. But I knew that justice wasn't something you could buy. And as the trial began, I felt the weight of the years of fighting that had led me to this very moment. The morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of my courtroom, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. I stood before the mirror in my chambers, adjusting my robes with practiced precision. My dark fingers smoothed the fabric. And for a moment, my mind wandered to the day ahead. It wasn't just another trial. This one was different. I had faced the corrupt before, but Caldwell was a man who had built an empire with his money, and he would stop at nothing to protect it. Yet, I wasn't afraid of him, nor his wealth. I had seen men like him come and go, but this time, I had something they didn't, the unwavering belief that justice would prevail. My clerk, Sarah Mitchell, knocked softly on my door, breaking my reverie. "They're ready for you, Judge," she said, her voice calm but laced with a hint of unease. I nodded, giving myself one last look in the mirror. The face that stared back at me was weathered by years of struggle and sacrifice. But it was still unbowed. I had risen from the streets of Brooklyn to become a judge, and though I'd been tested time and again, I had never compromised. Today, I wouldn't start. The courtroom was already buzzing with anticipation as I walked in, the weight of the trial hanging in the air. At the prosecution table sat Elena Cruz, a young assistant district attorney with a fire in her eyes that I had come to respect. She had spent months preparing this case, gathering evidence, building relationships with whistleblowers who were willing to testify. And at the defense table, Caldwell's lawyer, Victoria Holt, sat confidently, her expensive suit an indication of the wealth she represented. But as I looked at Caldwell himself, I saw more than just a businessman. I saw a man who had become so detached from the real world that he no longer understood the consequences of his actions. He strolled into the courtroom, 15 minutes late, his phone pressed to his ear. The arrogance in his posture, the smugness of his expression, it was clear he didn't think the rules applied to him. His designer suit fit him perfectly, and his silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He didn't even acknowledge the court's authority when the bailiff called for all to rise. Instead, he continued his conversation, oblivious to the respect the court demanded. I could feel the tension rising in the room as I took my seat. The gallery was watching, waiting for my response. And when I spoke, my voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen it all. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, my tone steady. "In this courtroom, we observe certain protocols. One of those is standing when the judge enters. Another is refraining from phone calls during proceedings." Caldwell finally ended his call, still holding his smug expression. He rose to his feet with deliberate slowness, and I saw a flicker of irritation in his eyes. But I didn't back down. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," I said. "Now, please be seated." The case began in earnest after that, with Elena presenting the charges: tax fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. The scale of Caldwell's alleged crimes was staggering: millions of dollars stolen from pension funds and community projects, all while the very people he had promised to help were left to suffer. But as the day went on, I began to realize that this was not just about money. This was about something deeper, something more dangerous. Caldwell didn't just break laws. He believed that the laws didn't apply to him. He thought his money could shield him from any consequence, that he could manipulate the very system that was supposed to protect the people. And that, I knew, was where we would draw the line. As the day drew to a close, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case would test more than just my judicial abilities. It would test everything I had come to believe about justice. Would it be enough to stand firm against Caldwell's power? Would the truth be enough to win the day? I didn't have all the answers yet. But I knew one thing for sure: justice had waited long enough. And I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers now. The next few days of the trial felt like a slow, relentless march, the tension building with every exchange. Caldwell's arrogance seemed to grow with each passing hour. He was used to running things, used to being the one who called the shots. But in my courtroom, things were different. The rules were clear. The truth had a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep you tried to bury it. As the trial progressed, the cracks in Caldwell's armor began to show. At first, they were subtle, slight twitches in his jaw, an occasional glance at his lawyer when certain evidence was introduced. But I saw them. I could tell he was beginning to feel the weight of what was happening. On the third day, during a break in proceedings, I stood in the window of my chambers, looking out over the city. The sun had dipped below the skyline, and the streets below were a blur of movement. But all I could think about was the case. Caldwell had so many connections, so many people in his pocket, and it felt as if every corner I turned, there was something else designed to bring this case to its knees. I had received a note earlier that morning, a simple warning, folded neatly in the hands of one of the court officers. It was discreet, almost casual in its tone. "Watch your back. Caldwell has a way of making problems disappear, sometimes even the ones that are sitting right in front of him." I had expected something like this. Men like Caldwell didn't just deal in money, they dealt in fear, in power, in influence. But what they didn't understand was that there were still a few of us who weren't afraid. They could throw all the money and power they wanted at me, but I wouldn't be moved. I had spent my life fighting for justice, and this case would be no different. In the courtroom, Elena Cruz was holding her ground. She was sharp, unyielding, and relentless. I saw in her the same fire I had once had: the belief that justice wasn't a commodity, that it wasn't something you could sell. She had spent months building her case, piecing together the truth with painstaking detail. She knew what was at stake, and she wasn't backing down. But as the days wore on, the threats became more personal. We received word that our key witness, a whistleblower from Caldwell's accounting department, had started to get cold feet. They had been followed. Photos of their children at school had shown up, along with a message telling them to stay quiet or face the consequences. The police, predictably, said there was nothing they could do. When Elena came to me with this news, I could see the frustration in her eyes. She was a fighter. But even she couldn't hide the toll this case was taking on her. We need to protect them, I told her firmly. This isn't just about Caldwell anymore. It's about making sure that the truth can't be silenced. No matter what happens, we don't stop. We spent the next few days gathering what we could, shoring up our case, getting additional security for the witnesses. I knew that Caldwell had resources beyond anything we could imagine. But I also knew that we had something he didn't: conviction. Caldwell could buy anyone. But there were still a few of us who couldn't be bought. That afternoon, the courtroom was packed as the defense presented their motions. Caldwell's lawyer, Victoria Holt, was a force in her own right. She was sharp, calculated, and knew how to twist the law to her advantage. She challenged every piece of evidence, looking for any crack, any small flaw that would allow her to tear down what we had built. But Elena was ready. She countered every move with precision, laying out the impact of Caldwell's schemes on vulnerable communities, on the retirees who had lost their pensions, on the families that Caldwell's greed had devastated. But then came the moment when Caldwell himself spoke. It wasn't much, just a brief moment when he addressed the court. His voice was dripping with disdain, the arrogance practically oozing from every word. "I don't know why we're even bothering with all this," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It's a witch hunt. I've been through worse before. And I'm still here. Trust me. This will all blow over." The words were meant to intimidate, to shake us. But they didn't. The more he spoke, the more his arrogance became his weakness. He thought he could charm the court, distract us with his wealth and status. But I saw through it. We all did. And in that moment, I realized something. The more he spoke, the more the truth revealed itself. As the day drew to a close, I couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was far from over. There were still so many unknowns, so many threats lurking in the shadows, but one thing was certain: Caldwell's empire was beginning to crack. He had underestimated what we were capable of. And I was ready to make sure he understood that in my courtroom, no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. Later that night, as I sat at my desk, the weight of the trial pressing on my shoulders, Elena came to see me. She looked tired, her eyes heavy, but there was a determination in her posture that I admired. "We're getting closer," she said quietly. "Every step we take, we're unraveling his empire. But we need to be ready for what comes next. He won't go down without a fight." I nodded, knowing she was right. The stakes had never been higher, and the path ahead would be treacherous. But we were prepared. I had spent my entire career preparing for this moment, and I wasn't about to back down now. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats. But I had something Caldwell didn't: truth. And that was a weapon he couldn't defeat. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. There was an air of anticipation, a sense that we were approaching a tipping point. As the doors opened, I could see the faces in the gallery, some hopeful, others uncertain, but all were focused on the drama unfolding before them. This was no longer just a case, it had become a battle for the very soul of justice itself. The forces aligned against us were powerful, and their reach extended far beyond what we could touch. But I had seen enough in my career to know that when you stand firm, no matter the pressure, the truth has a way of finding its path. Caldwell, for all his bravado, couldn't escape his own arrogance. That morning, as he strolled into the courtroom, he was greeted with his usual swagger. His designer suit, impeccably tailored, reflected his wealth, while his attitude was one of disdain. He spoke casually with his lawyer, Victoria Holt, ignoring the glares of the other attorneys in the room. The gallery held its collective breath, waiting for him to acknowledge the court's authority. But he didn't. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, my voice calm but firm, "we stand when the judge enters the room. I expect you to do the same." His smirk barely flickered as he rose slowly, as though granting me a personal favor. His phone still in hand. It was as if he thought the courtroom was his personal playground. The silence that followed his defiance was palpable, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us all. He seemed to think that his wealth, his power, and his ability to buy anyone and everyone would be enough to carry him through this. But he didn't understand that this was about more than just him. This was about the principle of justice, the very idea that no one, not even the wealthiest man in the room, could escape accountability. As Caldwell seated himself, I looked around the courtroom. Elena Cruz, our lead prosecutor, sat with a quiet intensity, ready to continue. But the energy in the room had shifted. The fight had become more than just a legal battle, it had become a moral one. It was a test of whether the system could truly hold the powerful to account, or whether money and influence would continue to reign supreme. The morning continued with motions, counter-arguments, and more of Caldwell's subtle attempts to sabotage the proceedings. Every time I ruled against him, his arrogance grew more pronounced. He couldn't stand being told what to do, especially by someone like me. But I was resolute. I had spent years in the trenches, seen the darkest sides of human nature, and there was nothing Caldwell could throw at me that I hadn't already faced. I wasn't going to let him walk away with his money and power intact. Not on my watch. Elena's cross-examinations were growing sharper. She was no longer just presenting facts, she was challenging Caldwell's very belief that he was above the law. She dissected every one of his actions, exposing the full extent of his manipulation and deceit. With every word, she chipped away at the facade he had carefully constructed. He was no longer the untouchable businessman, he was a criminal. And the courtroom was the one place where he couldn't hide. But it wasn't just the prosecution that was gaining ground. I had to be vigilant, to make sure that every move Caldwell made was scrutinized. I watched as his lawyer, Victoria Holt, tried to use every possible loophole, throwing out objections and motions, hoping to find some small crack in our case. She was good, no doubt about it. But what she didn't understand was that justice wasn't about finding technicalities. It was about the truth. And the truth was what we were getting closer to with each passing moment. During a brief recess, I stood alone in my chambers, the weight of the case pressing down on me. My mind raced, thinking about the stakes. This trial wasn't just about the law, it was about something much bigger. It was about showing the world that no one was beyond reach, that the law applied to everyone, no matter their wealth or influence. I couldn't afford to be distracted. I had a job to do, and I couldn't let anything, not even the constant threats or the pressure of the media, sway me from the path I knew was right. When we returned to the courtroom, the energy had shifted again. Caldwell's calm facade had cracked, and I could see the unease beneath the surface. His answers became more defensive, his glances at his lawyer more frequent. Elena, however, wasn't backing down. She pressed him on every detail, revealing his manipulations, his lies, and his attempts to bury the truth. With every piece of evidence, Caldwell's empire of corruption seemed to crumble just a little bit more. By the end of the day, I could feel the shift in the air. We weren't just getting closer to a verdict, we were making history. Caldwell's reign of corruption was beginning to fall apart, and there was no way for him to stop it now. He could try to buy off witnesses, to manipulate the media, to intimidate the jury, but in the end, the truth was a force he couldn't control. And that was the one thing he hadn't counted on. As I left the courtroom that night, I couldn't help but think about the people whose lives had been destroyed by Caldwell's greed. The retirees who had lost their pensions, the families who had lost their homes, the whistleblowers who had risked everything to speak out. This case wasn't just about exposing one man's crimes, it was about holding all the corrupt systems in place accountable. It was about showing the world that we would no longer let powerful men like Caldwell dictate the course of justice. Tomorrow would be another day in court. And I knew it would bring more challenges, more threats, More manipulation. But one thing had changed: Caldwell's empire was beginning to crack. And it would only be a matter of time before it collapsed completely. And when it did, we would have won. Not just for the victims, but for the very soul of justice. The next day, the courtroom felt heavier than before, as though the very air itself was charged with anticipation. We had reached a point of no return. Every word, every move, felt like it could tip the scales in favor of justice or let it slip away. Caldwell's arrogance was still palpable, but now it carried an undertone of desperation. He had underestimated the tenacity of the system, and more importantly, the people who still believed in it. But we all knew that, when cornered, the most dangerous predators would strike with everything they had. And Caldwell was cornered. As the trial resumed, the tension in the room was nearly unbearable. Caldwell, seated at the defense table, no longer exuded the same confident air he had at the beginning of the trial. His body language had changed, his posture was tense. His eyes darted around the courtroom as if looking for a way out. He no longer wore that smug expression. Instead, he looked like a man on the edge of a cliff, teetering dangerously. I could sense the shift in the room as Elena Cruz, our lead prosecutor, took her place at the table. She was focused, determined, and ready to deliver the final blow. The stakes had never been higher, and she knew that this moment could make or break the case. Caldwell's empire of lies, deceit, and corruption had already begun to unravel. But we needed more evidence, more witnesses, more clarity in our pursuit of truth. The day began with more testimony from key witnesses, each one unraveling another layer of Caldwell's intricate web of corruption. One by one, they stepped up, recounting the injustices they had suffered under his regime. The stories were devastating. Retired workers, small business owners, and vulnerable families all had been destroyed by Caldwell's greed. Every story reinforced the need for accountability, a need to ensure that people like him would never again be able to exploit the system for their own gain. I watched as Caldwell's expression grew more strained with each piece of evidence that was presented. It was as though the walls were closing in around him. His lawyer, Victoria Holt, continued to fight valiantly, throwing out objections and motions, hoping to disrupt the momentum. But Elena was relentless. She pressed on, her arguments clear and precise, and the courtroom watched in rapt attention as the case against Caldwell continued to build. It was during the lunch break that the true scale of the battle began to reveal itself. As I sat in my chambers, reviewing the case notes, I was interrupted by a quiet knock at the door. It was my clerk, Sarah Mitchell. "There's something you need to see, Your Honor," she said, handing me a small envelope. Inside was a note: "Watch your back. Caldwell owns half the police department. Evidence has a way of disappearing in his cases." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known this battle wasn't going to be easy, but this was the first direct threat to me personally. It was clear Caldwell's influence ran deeper than I had anticipated. But I had made it this far, there was no turning back now. I tucked the note into my pocket and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about the trial anymore. It was about something far bigger, something that transcended one man's greed. I returned to the courtroom, my mind racing. The trial had entered a new phase, one where the stakes weren't just legal, they were personal. Every word I spoke, every decision I made, could be under scrutiny. But I was undeterred. My career had been built on the belief that justice was worth fighting for, even when the odds were stacked against you. And if Caldwell thought he could intimidate me, he was gravely mistaken. The afternoon session began, and Caldwell's defiance continued. He answered questions with barely concealed contempt, his voice dripping with condescension. His arrogance was now his greatest vulnerability. Elena, for her part, had anticipated this. She was calm, methodical, and unwavering. She knew that this was the moment to strike, to expose Caldwell for the criminal he truly was. And then, it happened. During the cross-examination, Caldwell faltered. A flicker of unease crossed his face when certain documents were mentioned. It was subtle. But it was there. I saw it. For a brief moment. He looked like a man who knew the end was near. It was a small victory. But it was a victory nonetheless. It meant we were getting closer to breaking him. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. Caldwell's arrogance had turned to frustration. He knew the walls were closing in on him, and his once unshakable confidence was now replaced by a growing sense of fear. Elena pushed forward, presenting the final pieces of evidence, irrefutable proof of Caldwell's involvement in money laundering, tax fraud, and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable communities. By the time the court adjourned for the evening, Caldwell was a broken man. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As I left the courtroom, I couldn't help but reflect on the long road that had brought us here. This was a fight that had started with a single, quiet decision to stand up for what was right. And now, that decision was echoing through the halls of justice, shaking the foundations of everything Caldwell had built. But we weren't done yet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The forces that had protected Caldwell for so long were still out there lurking in the shadows, trying to manipulate the system in his favor. I knew they would stop at nothing to protect him. But I was ready. I had to be. This trial was bigger than Caldwell. It was bigger than me. It was about proving that the law was not just for the powerful, but for everyone. No one, not even a billionaire businessman, was above the law. As I sat alone in my office that night, I couldn't help but think of the people who had stood up to Caldwell, Elena, Officer Sullivan, and so many others who had risked everything to see this through. We had come so far, but we weren't finished yet. The final act of this battle was still to come, and I was determined to see it through to the end. For justice. For the truth. For the people who had suffered at Caldwell's hands. And as I closed the door to my chambers, I knew that the fight was far from over. But tomorrow, we would take another step closer to the victory that justice demanded. The next morning, the courtroom was charged with an almost palpable energy. The room felt like a pressure cooker, simmering with anticipation. Alexander Caldwell's empire of deceit was beginning to crack. But he wasn't going down without a fight. The day ahead would determine whether the truth would finally take center stage or if Caldwell's money and power would have the final say. As the trial resumed, I took my seat at the bench and glanced at the defense table. Caldwell's usual smugness was gone, replaced by a sullen, anxious air. His arrogance had been chipped away piece by piece. But it wasn't just his demeanor that had changed. It was his eyes, the eyes of a man who knew he had nowhere to hide anymore. The walls had closed in on him, and he could feel it. But it wasn't just Caldwell who had been affected by these revelations, the entire city was watching. The courthouse had become a battleground for something far greater than a single trial. It was about the very heart of justice. Elena Cruz, who had led this case with unwavering resolve, was ready for the final push. I could see the fire in her eyes as she approached the podium. This was the moment she had been working towards for months. Caldwell's web of corruption was so vast that it had taken nearly everything from him: the media, the public, the very system he thought he could manipulate. And now, he was on the verge of losing everything. I glanced at my watch as Elena began her closing argument. Her voice rang out, steady and forceful. She spoke not only for the victims but for the integrity of the entire justice system. Each word she spoke seemed to lift the weight of the room, making it clear that no amount of wealth or influence could change the truth. Caldwell's lawyer, Victoria Holt, looked increasingly uncomfortable. I couldn't help but notice the way she fidgeted with her papers as Elena systematically dismantled their defense. Every objection they raised seemed futile against the tide of irrefutable evidence that had mounted up over the past few weeks. Caldwell was guilty not just of the charges he faced, but of something far more sinister. He had corrupted the very institutions that were meant to protect the public. And now that corruption was being laid bare for everyone to see. Elena's words resonated deeply within the walls of the courtroom. She spoke not only of financial crimes, but of the far-reaching human toll that Caldwell's actions had inflicted. The children whose education was stolen. The elderly who had seen their retirement funds vanish. The families whose lives had been upended, all of them were now part of this greater fight for justice. It was a fight that transcended the legalities of the case. It was a fight for fairness, accountability, and the protection of the vulnerable. As Elena finished, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The magnitude of the case had become overwhelming. I took a moment to look around the room, my gaze drifting from the gallery to the prosecution table. It was as though we were standing at the edge of a precipice. If the truth prevailed, Caldwell's world would come crashing down. But if the powerful forces behind him were allowed to pull the strings one last time, it could all slip away. I leaned forward, preparing to make my own statement. I had witnessed the corruption, the manipulation, and the greed that had defined Caldwell's reign. But this was more than a case of financial crime, it was a battle for the very soul of the justice system. I had spent years on the bench, and I knew how fragile it could be. The temptation for shortcuts, the allure of bending the rules for the right price, it was all too easy to fall into that trap. But I had always believed that the law had to be bigger than the people who wielded it. Taking a deep breath, I addressed the courtroom, my voice cutting through the tension. The case before us is not just about one man's guilt or innocence. It's about the integrity of the system itself. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their wealth, no matter their power, can stand above the law. Mr. Caldwell's actions have affected more than just the victims here today. They have threatened the very foundation of what we hold dear as a society. That is why, no matter the pressure, no matter the threats, we must stand firm. There was a long pause as I allowed the weight of my words to sink in. Caldwell's eyes flickered with anger, but I could see the crack in his composure. The moment was fragile, and yet, somehow, it felt like the beginning of the end for him. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and the truth was now undeniable. The courtroom had become a space where no amount of money, no amount of influence, could cloud the vision of justice. As I prepared to adjourn for the day, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. It was Officer Sullivan, the young cop who had risked everything to come forward with the truth about the police department's corruption. His eyes met mine, filled with quiet resolve. I nodded at him, acknowledging the courage it had taken to expose the rot within the system. He wasn't the only one. There were so many others who had taken a stand. Elena Cruz, Officer Sullivan, and even Claire Caldwell, who had turned against her own brother to bring the truth to light. They had all shown what it meant to fight for justice, not just for the sake of one case, but for the future. But the fight was far from over. The road ahead was still fraught with danger. Caldwell's allies in the shadows had not disappeared. They were still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew that the final verdict would come with its own set of challenges. But I was resolute. Justice had to prevail, no matter what. As the courtroom emptied for the day, I stayed behind, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The stakes had never been higher, and yet, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Justice wasn't just a concept, it was a living, breathing force that could never be compromised. And as long as I sat on this bench, I would protect it with everything I had. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But I knew we were one step closer to victory. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. The morning of the final day in court arrived, and the air in the courthouse was thick with anticipation. It felt as though the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when justice would either be served or thrown into the abyss by one last desperate maneuver. The tension was suffocating, but there was also an undercurrent of something else, hope. As I walked into the courtroom, I could feel the weight of the case bearing down on me. This wasn't just about Alexander Caldwell anymore, This was about ensuring that the system could still function, that the truth could prevail over the web of corruption and deceit that had entangled so many. The trial had become a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what's right, even when the stakes were insurmountable. Caldwell had been watching us from his corner. His eyes narrowed, his arrogance replaced with something darker. The man who once strolled into the courtroom as though he owned it was now clearly cornered, his composure faltering. But he wasn't going to give up without a fight. His usual confidence had morphed into a bitter sense of defiance that seemed to seep into every fiber of his being. Even now, when it was clear that the walls were closing in, he still believed he could buy his way out, manipulate his way to victory. Elena Cruz, the assistant district attorney who had worked tirelessly to expose the depths of Caldwell's corruption, was standing at the prosecution table. She had been my ally throughout this journey, and together, we had peeled back the layers of Caldwell's carefully constructed empire. But even now, as we neared the end, I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She had poured everything into this case. She had fought not only for the victims but for the very notion of justice itself. And now, as the time for closing arguments neared, I could sense her resolve had never been stronger. I looked to the defense table. Victoria Holt, Caldwell's lawyer, was sitting straight-backed and composed, her steely eyes calculating her next move. She had been relentless in trying to block every piece of evidence, every testimony that threatened to unravel her client's facade. But the cracks in that facade were now too large to ignore. The evidence, the witness testimonies, the recordings, they had all converged into one undeniable truth: Caldwell was guilty. The gallery was quiet, the murmur of whispers fading as the proceedings began. I called the court to order and watched as the defense made its final arguments. Holt's voice echoed through the room, trying to play on the jury's doubts. She spoke of discrepancies in the evidence, of technicalities, of procedural errors. But I could hear the thinness of her arguments. It was all too transparent. She was grasping at straws, trying to salvage what was left of Caldwell's tarnished reputation. She attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case by attacking the integrity of our key witness, Margaret Wilson, who had risked everything to testify about Caldwell's financial schemes. She questioned the validity of the recordings Claire had provided, attempting to dismiss them as mere personal vendettas. But the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence was irrefutable. And even more damning was the testimony of Officer Sullivan, who had bravely stood up against the corruption in his own department, putting his own safety at risk. Elena rose to present the prosecution's closing statement. Her voice was firm and steady, unwavering despite the enormity of the case. As she laid out the facts once more, she spoke not only of Caldwell's crimes but of the impact they had had on the people who had trusted the system, the victims of his fraud, those who had lost everything, who had been left to pick up the pieces of their lives after Caldwell had destroyed them for his own gain. Elena's words rang with an undeniable truth, and I could see the jury's eyes locked on her, every word sinking in. This was no longer about a high-profile businessman who had broken the law. This was about accountability. This was about sending a message that no one, not even the wealthiest or most powerful, was above the law. As Elena finished, I knew that it was time for my final ruling. The room fell silent. Caldwell's fate hung in the balance, and the fate of the city, of its people, rested in my hands. I stood up and addressed the court, my voice carrying the gravity of the moment. The evidence presented here today speaks for itself. Mr. Caldwell's actions have caused immeasurable harm to individuals, families, and entire communities. His attempts to buy influence, to manipulate the system, to destroy lives for his own gain, have been laid bare. This case is not just about one man, it's about ensuring that our justice system remains just. That truth can never be bought, never be manipulated. I paused, letting my words settle in the air. And that is why, despite the efforts to intimidate, despite the bribes, Despite the attempts to destroy evidence and witnesses, justice will prevail. I turned to the jury. You have heard the facts. And you know what must be done. The law is clear. The truth is clear. The gallery held its collective breath as the jury retired to deliberate. The weight of the case, of the decision they were about to make, was immense. But I knew, in my heart, that the truth would win out. It had to. The people who had stood up against Caldwell's corruption had shown that, even in the face of intimidation, the power of truth could not be silenced. It wasn't just about the verdict. It was about sending a message to everyone in the courtroom. To every citizen who had ever felt powerless, the system could work. Justice could prevail. No matter how deep the corruption ran. No matter how powerful the forces against it. Justice would always find a way. And today, justice would have its day. The courtroom was packed. The tension was palpable. Like the calm before the storm. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Even on the silent, composed faces of the jurors. Each of them was holding something back, something that would soon come rushing out. They had deliberated for hours. And the entire city seemed to be waiting for their verdict. Outside the courthouse, a sea of protesters had gathered. Signs raised high, demanding justice. The media was in a frenzy. Cameras flashing as they captured every moment of the trial. Every expression on the faces of those who had witnessed it all unfold. But inside the courtroom, the air was thick with a quiet, oppressive stillness. I sat at the bench, my hands folded neatly before me, my gaze fixed on the door. The jurors were on their way back. And with them, the moment of reckoning. Caldwell, sitting rigidly at the defense table, tried to maintain his usual air of arrogance. But there was a crack in his composure now. A nervous tick that betrayed the fear he was trying to suppress. His earlier confidence had crumbled, replaced by a flicker of doubt. He knew what was coming, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up with him. The doors opened, and the jury filed in. There was no dramatic fanfare, no grand gestures, just the quiet shuffle of feet as they took their seats. The foreperson stood, and I could see the weight of her decision reflected in her eyes. She was about to announce the outcome of a trial that had gripped the entire city. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but carrying the gravity of the moment. "We, the jury, have reached a verdict." Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his face pale. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The weight of his crimes, of his empire of corruption, was about to be laid bare. The world was watching. On the charge of tax fraud, the foreperson continued. "We find the defendant, Alexander Caldwell, guilty." A murmur rippled through the room. Caldwell's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking nervously toward his attorney, Victoria Holt. But she gave no sign of reassurance. The weight of the guilty verdict was sinking in, and there was no escaping it now. The foreperson continued, ticking off the other charges. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. Each word was like a hammer falling on Caldwell's carefully constructed world. The once untouchable businessman was now being stripped of his defenses. His empire crumbling before his eyes. The reality was setting in. And Caldwell could no longer hide from the truth. I watched him carefully, his once smooth face now contorted with a mixture of disbelief and anger. His facade had shattered, leaving only a man who had spent his life exploiting the system, now confronted with the consequences of his actions. The foreperson paused, and I could see her glance down at the paper in front of her, collecting her thoughts before delivering the final blow. "On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice," she said, her voice unwavering, "we find the defendant guilty." Caldwell sat back in his chair, his face drained of color, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, the pressure of the moment causing him to tremble ever so slightly. This was it. This was the moment that would define his legacy: corruption, greed, and a complete disregard for the people he had hurt. The jury's decision was final, and the path forward was clear. As I looked around the courtroom, I could see the reactions. The victims of Caldwell's crimes, the families who had lost everything, the community that had suffered under his influence, each of them had come to bear witness to this moment. Their faces showed a mixture of relief, disbelief, and sorrow. This trial was never just about the money Caldwell had stolen. It was about the lives he had ruined, the people he had betrayed, the communities he had decimated for his own gain. Caldwell stood, his face twisted in fury as he turned to face his sister, Claire. Her eyes met his, and there was no hatred there, just a quiet sadness. The moment was personal for her. She had been part of his rise to power, but she had seen the darkness that had overtaken him. She had watched as he destroyed not just the lives of others, but her own family in the process. Now, she was watching him pay for the harm he had caused. The silence between them was deafening. He had no words left. His empire was no more. I stood up, addressing the court, my voice steady but carrying the weight of the responsibility I had been entrusted with. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, my eyes fixed on him, "you have been found guilty on all counts. Your actions have left a trail of destruction. From the communities you've devastated to the people you've manipulated and harmed. Justice has been delayed for too long. But today, it has finally been served." Caldwell's face was pale, his earlier bravado replaced by a deep, gnawing fear. He had played the game of power and influence, believing that money could solve every problem. But today, the game had changed. Today, he was no longer the one in control. He had underestimated the strength of those who were committed to justice, those who had risked everything to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The courtroom buzzed as federal marshals moved to take Caldwell into custody. His bodyguards, who had once been his closest allies, now stood on the sidelines, powerless. Caldwell's face twisted in rage as he was escorted out of the courtroom, shouting threats and curses. But it was too late. His fate had been sealed. As the doors closed behind him, I took a deep breath. The battle was over. But the fight for justice had only just begun. Elena Cruz, who had stood by me through every twist and turn of this case, looked at me with a quiet smile. There was a sense of relief. Yes. But also a deep, abiding exhaustion. We had fought hard for this moment. But there was still so much work to be done. The trial of Alexander Caldwell had shown us the flaws in the system, the corruption that could seep in and poison everything. But it had also reminded us of something far more important: justice, when it is done right, is more than just a system of laws. It is a living force. A force that can right wrongs, heal wounds, and change the world. As I left the courthouse that day, I looked out over the city. The streets, once filled with the shadow of Caldwell's influence, now seemed brighter, freer. The city had been through a trial, but so had its people. And like the city, they were stronger for it. The weeks that followed Caldwell's conviction were filled with a strange mixture of quiet satisfaction and palpable tension. The verdict had been delivered, but the true impact of that moment would unfold over the months to come. The city was buzzing with news reports, social media discussions, and protests in the streets, demanding not just justice for Caldwell's crimes, but for a complete overhaul of the system that had allowed him to operate with such impunity for so long. For the victims of Caldwell's empire, the trial had been a long and painful journey, but it had also been a victory, one that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The families whose pensions had been stolen, the communities whose development projects had been siphoned off for Caldwell's personal gain, and the countless individuals whose lives had been irrevocably altered by his greed, each of them now had the truth on their side. I spent many nights in my office, reviewing the case files, reflecting on the investigation, and preparing for what would come next. The criminal convictions were a significant blow to Caldwell's empire. But his network of corruption reached far beyond the courthouse. There were still officials, police officers, and business leaders who had been complicit in his schemes. They were all now in the spotlight, their actions under scrutiny in a way they hadn't been before. One evening, as I sat in my office, Elena Cruz walked in with a stack of documents. Her face was drawn, tired from the long months of work. But there was a fire in her eyes, an unspoken determination that we weren't done yet. "We've got something new," she said, placing the documents on my desk. "I think it's time to start going after the ones who helped him hide his tracks. Caldwell may be behind bars, but his influence is still out there." I looked at the documents she had brought me: financial records, emails, testimonies from former employees. It was all there, the final pieces of the puzzle that would unravel the rest of Caldwell's criminal network. As I flipped through the pages, I could feel the weight of the work ahead of us. But I knew that we had no choice but to press on. Caldwell had tried to break the system, now we had to ensure that the system could heal, that the truth could continue to flow. Elena sat across from me, her hands folded on the table. "I know it's been a long road," she said quietly, "but we're close. There are still people out there who think they're untouchable. But we can make sure they answer for what they've done. We can make sure that Caldwell wasn't the last one." Her words were a reminder of the true battle we were facing. It wasn't just about one man's fall from grace. It was about the far-reaching consequences of his actions, and how we could dismantle the system of power and corruption that had enabled him to rise to the top. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But it was necessary. I looked out of my office window, the city lights flickering below. The streets that had once seemed dark and oppressive now held a different kind of promise. A promise that change was possible. That the work we had done together was not just about one trial, but about creating a lasting shift in the way people viewed justice and accountability. We were no longer fighting just for the victims of Caldwell's schemes. We were fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced. For everyone who had ever been told that the truth didn't matter because money and power would always win. The phone on my desk rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I answered, and the voice on the other end was familiar: Detective Michael Sullivan, the officer who had come forward with crucial information during the trial. "Judge Carter," he said, "there's something you need to see. It's bigger than anything we've uncovered so far. I think we've found the last piece of the puzzle." I could hear the urgency in his voice, the gravity of what he was about to share. "What's going on?" I asked, standing up from my desk. "I'll explain when I see you. Meet me at the office. It's time to go after the rest of them." I hung up the phone, my heart racing. I knew that the final stretch of this case was going to be the most dangerous. But I also knew that we couldn't stop now. If we were going to make sure that Caldwell's influence didn't linger, we had to uncover the full extent of his reach. And for that, we would have to take risks. I left my office and met Elena in the hallway. "Sullivan's got something," I told her. "I think we're finally going to get to the bottom of all this." Her eyes met mine, determination evident in her gaze. "Let's go. We've come this far. We're not stopping now." As we walked through the courthouse, the weight of the case was on both of us. The journey had been long, the stakes had been high, and the pressure had been relentless. But we had made it this far, and now we were about to take the final steps toward bringing the rest of Caldwell's network to justice. The road ahead was still fraught with obstacles, but there was a sense of purpose now, a feeling that no matter what came next, we had already won the most important battle. And we were about to take one more step toward a city and a justice system where corruption would no longer have a place to hide. In the end, Judge Carter's unwavering commitment to justice not only brought down one of the city's most powerful criminals but also sparked a transformation in the very fabric of the legal and political system. As Caldwell's empire crumbled, so did the illusion that money and power could shield individuals from accountability. The battle for truth was far from over. But the seeds of change had been planted. With new reforms in place and more whistleblowers coming forward, the city began to heal. and the voices of those who had been silenced for so long were finally being heard. Judge Carter's victory was a reminder that justice is not just a concept but a force that requires constant vigilance. To continue following these powerful life stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring tales of courage and transformation.